Neville gave us a two-phase formula for manifesting while you sleep. Most people use the first phase religiously and ignore the second one completely. That's why the technique works once, maybe twice, then stops working, or why the result shows up and dissolves 3 weeks later like it was never real. Here's the part nobody talks about. You spend 30 minutes before bed doing SATs. You loop the scene, you feel it real, you fall asleep in the wish fulfilled. Perfect execution. But then you wake up, and for the next 23 hours, you're checking your bank account, scanning for evidence, emotionally reacting like the person who still doesn't have it. You planted the seed at night, you dug it up all day. Neville described both phases explicitly in Seedtime and Harvest. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what the second phase is, why it's harder than the first, and how to stop breaking your own state between sessions. Let me show you what Neville actually meant by that parable. In 1956, he published Seedtime and Harvest, and the opening metaphor is agricultural. The imaginal act is planting. You construct a scene that implies the wish is already fulfilled. You loop it in the drowsy state before sleep until it feels natural. You fall asleep in that feeling. That's the seed going into the ground. But here's what most people miss. Neville spent the second half of the parable warning against digging up the seed. He said you plant it at night, then you disturb the soil every morning by checking for results, reacting to opposing evidence, emotionally living as though the thing is still absent. The seed never gets a chance to germinate because you keep uprooting it to see if it's growing yet. This is not mystical, it's mechanical. The imaginal act plants the assumption in your subconscious, but the waking state either protects that assumption or cancels it. Most people only practice the planting, they completely ignore the soil management. So, if that's the parable, let's break down what Neville actually prescribed for both phases, because this is where modern teaching falls apart. Phase 1 is the imaginal act. You probably already know this part. You enter the state akin to sleep. That's the drowsy borderline between waking and sleeping, where the conscious mind releases control and the subconscious becomes impressionable. You construct a short first person scene. It has to imply the wish is already done. You loop the scene, you add a lullaby phrase, you fall asleep feeling it real. Neville described this in Feeling is the Secret in 1944, and again in Out of This World in 1949. If you've been practicing SATs for more than a few months, you likely do this correctly. This is the easy part. Neville said that explicitly in his Los Angeles lectures during the 1950s. Most people can loop a scene for 10 minutes before bed. The problem is not here. Phase 2 is the waking assumption, and this is the part almost no one teaches. But before I explain what the waking assumption is, there's a specific type of behavior that tells you whether your nighttime work actually impressed your subconscious or not. I'll show you that behavior in a moment, because without recognizing it, you'll never know if your imaginal act is working or failing. Most teachers will tell you to do your visualization at night, then let go and detach during the day. They're wrong. Neville never taught detachment. He taught the opposite. In Prayer, the Art of Believing, published in 1945, Neville has an entire chapter on the Sabbath. He reinterprets it as psychological instruction. After the imaginal act, you must keep the Sabbath. That means you rest in the assumption that it is done. You stop laboring. But rest does not mean forgetting, it does not mean detaching, it means you refuse to return to the old state. The world is still going to present evidence of the old facts. Your bank account will still show the same balance. Your SP will still act the same way. The job offer hasn't arrived yet. The Sabbath is the discipline of not reacting to that evidence as though you are still the person who doesn't have the thing. Neville also described this as thinking from the end, not of the end. Most people practice thinking of their desire during visualization. They see it as separate, out there, something to obtain. But Neville's instruction is to think from the end. You place your inner eye in the reality where it is already done. You look at the old world from that vantage point. And this applies not just during the imaginal act, it applies throughout the waking day. If you are thinking from the wish fulfilled, you interpret circumstances differently. You are not waiting for confirmation because you are already the person who has it. Your internal dialogue reflects that. Your emotional reactions reflect that. This is not performance, this is identity. Here's where the roller coaster happens. You do SATs perfectly at night, but during the day you check your bank account, you scan your SP's social media, you refresh your inbox, you emotionally react to opposing evidence like the person who still doesn't have it. If you've been doing SATs every night for months without consistent results, the problem isn't the technique, the problem is the hours between your practice sessions. Let me explain. Neville identified checking behavior as diagnostic. It reveals you are still asleep in the old state. Actually, let me rephrase that. The checking is the state, that's the behavior I mentioned earlier. Here's the diagnostic. If you were truly in the state of the wish fulfilled, you wouldn't check because you'd already have it internally. The moment you catch yourself checking your bank balance, scanning for evidence, or refreshing for updates, you've just discovered you're still identifying as the person who doesn't have it. That behavior is the answer to whether your imaginal act took root. If it had, the checking impulse wouldn't be there. In Out of This World, Neville used the metaphor of a battery. The imaginal act charges it, but the waking state drains it or sustains it depending on whether you return to former assumptions. You plant the seed at night. You dig it up every morning by living from the old identity. The seed never gets a chance to root. Here's a pattern I've watched repeat with student after student. Someone practices SATs for their SP every night for 2 weeks. They do everything correctly, they loop the scene, they fall asleep in the feeling. Then during the day, the SP posts a story with someone else, and within seconds, the entire imaginal structure collapses. They spiral into doubt. They text a friend to analyze what the post means. They go back that night and repeat SATs, but now they're doing it from desperation, not assumption. What happened? They spent 30 minutes at night building the state of already being with the SP. They spend the rest of the day operating as the person who is separated from the SP, threatened by evidence, emotionally dependent on external validation. The imaginal act had no soil to root in. It was cancelled by the waking state within hours. The breakthrough comes when they stop checking, not as a rule, not as superstition, but because the internal identity finally shifted. They wake up one morning and realize they forgot to check the SP's profile, not because they forced themselves to stop, because they genuinely felt like the person who already has the relationship. That shift is the evidence the assumption took. The manifestation follows days or weeks later, but the internal shift always comes first. Neville said this explicitly in his teachings from 1945. He taught that what you do in your hour of silence, in the stillness of your bed before sleep, must be sustained by your waking attitudes. Most people read that sentence and skip right past it. That's the sentence that contains the entire second phase of the formula. The imaginal act is the hour of silence. The waking attitudes are everything else. If the waking attitudes contradict the imaginal act, you've built the state for 1 hour and dismantled it for 23. That's not a technique problem, that's an architecture problem. Now, here's the part that actually makes the difference, and it's the detail that gets stripped out of every modern course. The waking assumption is not something you perform. I'll show you what it actually is right now, because if you try to force it, you cancel the whole thing. So, how do you actually maintain the waking assumption without forcing it or performing it? Here's what Neville said about that. The waking assumption is not a technique you do, it's a byproduct of a successful imaginal act. If the night session truly impressed your subconscious, the waking state will naturally reflect the new identity without effort. Neville called this the effortless way in The Power of Awareness, published in 1952. He said the moment you try to feel wealthy or loved or successful during the day, you've admitted internally that you are not those things. The waking assumption must be effortless to be effective. But if you find yourself struggling during the day, that's feedback. It means the imaginal act has not yet impressed the subconscious deeply enough. Return to the night practice, go deeper into the drowsy state, loop the scene longer, or simplify the scene. The sign the assumption took is that during the day you catch yourself naturally thinking and feeling from the wish fulfilled without trying. You're not forcing it, you're not performing it. It's just who you are now. I put together a free guide in the description that walks through the full diagnostic for this, where your waking state might be breaking down, how to catch it before it cancels the night work. It's called the Source Code Diagnostic. I'll put the link at the end. Here's what most people don't realize about why this two-phase formula matters so much. You spend maybe 30 minutes to an hour doing SATs before sleep. You construct the scene, you feel it real, you fall asleep in the wish fulfilled. Perfect execution. But there are 23 other hours in your day. If those hours are spent in the old state, reacting to circumstances as the person who doesn't have it, running old internal conversations, emotionally identifying with lack, you've built the new state for 1 hour and dismantled it for the rest of the time. Before I show you the application protocol, there's one more thing I haven't told you yet. It's about your baseline state the moment you open your eyes in the morning, before you've made a single decision. That baseline determines whether everything you practiced the night before survives contact with your day or gets erased in the first 60 seconds. I'll address that now because it's the difference between technique that sticks and technique that evaporates. Remember when I mentioned the seed earlier? This is where that metaphor becomes practical. The imaginal act works. The issue has never been the technique, it's that the technique is only the first phase. The second phase happens when you're awake. And the second phase is what decides whether the seed you planted actually grows or gets uprooted before it breaks the surface. Here's the baseline reality. The first thing your mind tells you about who you are when you wake up is your actual operating state, not the state you practiced last night, the state you've been living from for months or years. That's the soil condition. If the first thought tomorrow morning is, I still don't have it, or I wonder if it's working, or let me check if anything changed, you've just watched your real state announce itself, and that state is what the seed has to grow through. The reason SATs works sometimes and fails other times isn't that you're doing the technique wrong, it's that you've been using half the formula. You plant the seed at night, you uproot it all day. The imaginal act is one phase, the waking assumption is the second phase. Neville gave us both. We've been practicing one and ignoring the other. That's the gap. That's why the results appear and evaporate. That's why the technique feels inconsistent when the technique itself has never been the problem. Seeing this is the easy half. You can already feel which hours are dismantling what you built at night. Installing a state that holds across the full day is the work. It's the half almost no one walks you through. Because pointing at the gap is easy and building the protocol to close it is not. You need more than theory. You need a system that shows you exactly where your waking state breaks down, which triggers pull you back into the old identity, and how to architect assumption across your day without forcing it or performing it. So there's a specific next step for the people who want to actually close that gap. If you want the night work you're doing to finally stick during the day, I built the source code diagnostic for exactly that. It walks you through where your waking state is collapsing, which hours are canceling the imaginal work, and how to halt assumption between sessions without effort. It's free. The link is in the description right below this video. Tonight, do your imaginal act like you always have. But tomorrow morning, catch the first thing your mind tells you about who you are the moment you wake up. That's your waking state talking. That's the soil the seed is trying to root in. Neville said it plainly in his teachings from 1949. Your imagination is able to do anything, but you must not think that imagining will do it. You must enter into the image and think from it. Not just at night, all day. That's the formula, both phases. Now you know which one you've been missing.